Good afternoon. How are you, Rich? Well, Rich, if you're good, then I'm even better. But I just have to say that Javi over here with the hat, you know, when I grew up, I want to have his fashion sense. I'm committing a crime of fashion here, relatively speaking. So thanks for joining me. My name is Bob West. I'm Chief Security Officer for Palo Alto Networks Prisma Cloud Division. It's our cloud security group. And I'm going to talk to you about the top 5 cloud native risks. So hopefully this will be helpful. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the evolution of threats, what they mean, talk about digital transformation, what we see as the most common cloud threats, and ultimately what should you be doing in terms of best practices, leading practices, whatever you want to call it, as you're moving assets to the cloud, and in particular, code to cloud. I always think it's important to understand where we've been, to know where you're going, and I started working in security, I think it was somewhere around the Jurassic period in '95 or so. And one of the things I remember that year, Kevin Mitnick was caught by Tsutomu Shimomura, and that was one of the most visible issues of that era. And if you don't know the history, one of the many things that Kevin did was he stole a whole bunch of credit cards. He used free phone services like a couple of people had been talking about earlier. I think it was Mr. Schwartow. And as a side story, I was at a conference and Kevin was doing a book signing, and I was feeling a little mischievous, so I walked up to him and I asked him, to sign the book to Tsutomu Shimomura, and he wasn't really appreciative of that. But in the mid-'90s, the majority of the issues that we were experiencing were website defacements, right? Think of virtual graffiti, if you will. And then in the early 2000s, the issues that we started dealing with were more aggressive, more hostile. So back in 2001, Code Red and NIMDA came out, and just to give you an idea of what it meant to me when I was working at a bank, we estimated that it took about $2 million worth of man-hours to fix the issues that NIMDA brought up. And we had our environment locked up. It was pretty locked down, and the reason we had an issue was there was a contractor who decided that anti-malware software was optional, and that cost us $2 million of man-hours. We then transitioned to nation-state attacks in the late 2000s. So China has been one of the significant players. These days there's a handful of nations like Russia, Iran, Iraq, North Korea. And one of the things I remember, I was doing some consulting around 2010, 2011, and my client, who is a Fortune 50 company, decided that they had acquired a Chinese company. And their perspective was, we own this Chinese entity, therefore we can trust them. And so there were no firewall rules in between the U.S. entity and the Chinese entity. So as an organization, what you have to do if you haven't worked with Chinese entities, you have to make the assumption that there's some tie, formally or informally, with the Chinese government. And ultimately, their goal is to steal intellectual property and use it for competitive advantage. So then in the early 2010s, we moved to more specialized malware, such as financial crimeware and point-of-sale malware. If you remember the Target breach in 2013, there are a couple things that were pretty interesting about them. One of them was that the bad guys entered into Target's infrastructure through their HVAC vendor. And if you think of a typical organization, you typically have dozens or hundreds, if not thousands, of third parties that you rely on to do business. And yet at the same time, HVAC vendors are probably not as sophisticated as large enterprises, right? They don't have the resources. And the implications of that were Target had about 100 million credit and debit cards stolen. And one of the things I remember was that Chase had 2 million credit and debit cards compromised as a consequence of the incident. And their general counsel was on the phone with Target. It's like, let's have a little chat, right? Because ultimately it cost them X number of dollars to reissue their credit and debit cards. There's the damage to their brand and reputation, et cetera. In the last 5 years, we've started to deal with ransomware, and it's become much more prevalent. Right before I started working with Palo Alto Networks about a year ago, I got a 911 call, and a Fortune 1000 company suffered a significant ransomware attack. I think it was Kate Keene that was talking about the cost of breaches, and the small ones were about $1 million, if my memory serves me correctly. In this particular case, there was a mid-seven-figure ransom that was paid, but that was the small cost. We estimated that the total cost was about $500 million when you take into account litigation, loss of customers, disruption of business. And so those are the types of issues that we're dealing with. One of the things that Chris Roberts was saying earlier is you actually need to listen to the issues and communicate very clearly. So the second day that I was working on this project, I was in front of the board of directors. No pressure at all, right? And they're in their defense, they were very concerned. And for those of you that don't know me, I've had 3 chief information security officer roles, and they were either very heavy builds or turnarounds. So it was within my comfort level, and the message that I sent to them was, I can take care of this, but it's not going to happen overnight. Ultimately, to get to cybersecurity nirvana, it'll probably take about 3 years, but we'll make incremental progress along the way. And in the next 6 months or so, we will make significant progress so that, the chance of things being a 5-alarm fire as opposed to a brush fire will go down. So think of what we've been living through in the last dozen years or so. We've been going through one of the biggest technology transformations, certainly in my career. I've been working in technology and security for about 40 years. And I would say that this is pretty equivalent to moving from mainframes to distributed networks in the late 80s, early 90s. So every company is either moving to the cloud or is in transition in some aspect, right? And there's significant financial benefit moving to the cloud. So think of, you compare operating in the cloud versus having traditional data centers. You've got the infrastructure that you need for the data centers. You've got the servers. You have the people that you need to run and operate them. And as trite as it might sound, it does in fact create more agile organizations. So as an example, about 20 years ago, we did an enterprise application implementation that took us about 1.5 years to implement when I was working with the same bank. We paid about $100 million for the implementation. And then there's the care and feeding that goes on afterwards, right? Or in this particular case, I could buy licenses for Salesforce for a fraction of that cost. You may not necessarily be up and running overnight, but it's a matter of months as opposed to a matter of years in terms of implementing the environment. So at the same time, going back to what I just showed you, we're operating in a continuously more aggressive environment. The other thing I would tell you is that there's still a lot of organizations that perceive that if they're managing their infrastructure, they're more secure. And I would couch that with about 3,000 companies in the United States are informed by the FBI every year that they've been compromised, and that's the first time they're hearing about it, right? So there's a disconnect in terms of perception and what the reality is. As Chris was saying earlier, one of the main things that you need to understand is what you have. And the company I was consulting with, when I asked them, so, what's your application portfolio? And it's like, well, we don't know. That's not unique. I would say the majority of large enterprises simply don't understand what their application portfolio is. And if you don't understand that, then it's impossible to protect it holistically. Moving to the cloud is actually an interesting value proposition because for most companies, it allows them to re-architect and redesign everything that they're doing. And one of the key things is making sure that rather than doing a lift and shift in applications, that you think about what you're doing, right? How should this application be designed so it can scale, it's protected properly, et cetera. And here's some interesting statistics. I know Kate was alluding to this earlier in terms of the velocity of moving to the cloud. So in 2020, about 30% of enterprises had more than half of their workloads in the cloud. We just did a research study, and as of this year, close to 70% of large enterprises have more than half of their workloads in the cloud. And when you look back at why this is happening, so February, March of 2020, the pandemic happens. And you really didn't understand what was going to come next, right? How long is the pandemic going to last? What's the implications to us from a business perspective? How much cash do we have on hand as an organization? What's our overall cost of managing technology? So going back to the efficiency and the cost of doing business in the cloud, most CFOs and the rest of the leadership teams are saying, so what do we need to do to get there, right? And at the same time, organizations in general got to put my reading glasses on so I can read my screen here. Most organizations don't have the skill sets to understand how do you protect cloud security? What are the issues that I need to deal with? So if you look at this slide, 42% of cloud formation templates are insecure. 51% of exposed Dockers exposed to the internet, the containers use insecure defaults, which is an age-old issue, right? You think of when you're loading operating systems onto hardware, or you're loading an application, they generally have default accounts. And one of the biggest sins that I've seen is people don't change passwords on system management accounts, et cetera. 24% of exposed cloud hosts have known vulnerabilities. And this is pretty easy to get to this point where, you think of the Patch Tuesday opportunity that we have when Microsoft issues their latest patches. One of the things that happens periodically is, they'll do a great job of putting the patches out there, but sometimes they miss just patching the vulnerability, and the operating system defaults go back to square one. And when that happens, you have all the core vulnerabilities that the operating system has. 43% of cloud databases aren't encrypted. And so think of it this way, right, is, the major cloud service providers do a very good job. They have good native tools to protect the environment. But you have to go on the assumption that the Microsofts and Amazons and Googles of the world ultimately are going to get compromised. And it's your responsibility as an organization to make sure that you're protecting the environment properly, because ultimately if there's an issue, and Rich, you'll appreciate this one, the lawyers aren't going to care that your information is in Google or Microsoft or wherever. Your customers are going to make the assumption that you're actually responsible for it, and legally that's absolutely the case. So it's a shared responsibility in between the cloud service providers and the application providers and yourself to make sure that information is being protected properly. So let me tell you about the top 5 cloud native risks. So application vulnerabilities are one of the significant issues. And this makes a lot of sense if you think of application developers in general. When they've gone to school, they haven't been taught how to code securely. And so what happens is, as an organization, if you haven't educated them how to code securely, they'll start writing all this code with a bunch of basic application security issues. You think of the OWASP top 10 list and things like SQL injection issues or cross-site scripting. It's all the basics. And the challenge is that you have to, number one, make sure that you're teaching your developers to code securely, but also make sure that you're integrating application security testing throughout the development and management life cycle. I like to use quality as an analogy. So think of when a car rolls off the assembly line, you don't say, let's add quality now, right? It's a function of the manufacturing process. And if you don't have the right level of quality, you start having defects. And the defects, if they're severe enough, then you start having recalls. And recalls are a pain in the posterior, they're expensive. But the really big hit is to brand and reputation. I look at security breaches as being similar to recalls, where they're expensive, but damage to brand and reputation is the big cost. So paying attention to security on the front end through the development process is something that's particularly important. One of the statistics that you see here, 91% of applications have critical or high vulnerabilities in the images that are being implemented. So if that's the case, you need to understand what are they, how do I fix them, and how do I do that with predictability. The second risk is in infrastructure misconfigurations. So think of if you have infrastructure and applications that are internet facing. All you have to do is leave a port open, and now you've got this tunnel to get into the application environment. It creates a really simple attack vector, and like many of us, attackers and nation states are generally lazy, right? They're going to come along and look at the virtual doors and windows, right? Are they locked properly? And typically they'll just knock on a door, okay, this is open, then I can get in and start creating some mischief, steal intellectual property, execute a ransomware attack. And so that's something that you need to pay attention to. I was talking about how the issues we were dealing with have changed over time. Malware isn't an exception. So one of the challenges is that malware is evolving very quickly. Think of cryptojacking containers. And this is one of the things that the bad actors are particularly attuned to, right, is they'll take containers, take them over. They could use it as a launching point. They could do a ransomware attack. There's a number of things that you can do if you're taking advantage of insecure infrastructure, and the evolving malware scenario is certainly one of them. The next one is over-provisioned access. So for those of you, if you know anything about identity and access management, think of a typical employee that joins an organization, and if they're with an organization for a given period of time, they will be in several roles. And what happens is the access that's been granted to you when you join the organization, if you're not managing identity and access management properly, they retain the rights to the applications they were using in job number 1. They move into job number 2, and they get access to the new applications. But you have this accumulation of rights that happen. And ultimately, when you look at attacks, the criminal organizations and the bad boys and girls are doing account takeovers, right? And the ideal scenario is that they either escalate privileges so that they have admin rights, or they'll look for admin accounts. Again, think of the default accounts that come with operating systems and applications, and take them over. And I'll give you an extreme example. The client I've been telling you about, we did an assessment on the number of admin accounts they had, and ultimately it turned out that they had about 35,000 accounts that had admin privileges, and the average number of admin accounts on each machine on a total population of 60,000 desktops and laptops, there were over 300 accounts that had admin rights on each of those machines. Not exactly an ideal scenario. And, this isn't unusual, right? I would say that, the enlightened folks like Kate and a few other folks, there's a very small number of them that really understand how to manage security at an enterprise level well. And then there's everybody else. So you look at the bottom half of the Fortune 500, for example, there are a lot of people that simply don't run their shops well. And to Chris's point earlier, a lot of it is a lack of communication, a lot of, I remember when I joined the bank I was telling you about, in the first week I had a meeting with my CIO, and he told me, if there's something that you remember out of your experience here, it's learn how to tell a good story. And telling a good story is something that, it's exceptionally important, because most technology people don't understand how to speak business language, right? And if you don't tell a story in terms that an organization understands of business leadership, they're not going to get it. And if they don't get it, you're not going to get the resources and money to do your job. So, for example, in my CISO roles, one of the things that I've done is, if I'm talking to a CEO, I'll typically, the conversation will revolve around corporate strategy. If I'm talking to a general counsel, it's going to revolve, how does an investment in protecting information address legal risk? So a lot of it is really understanding, how do you communicate your point effectively? The final cloud-native risk that we see in terms of the short list is insecure APIs. And this becomes particularly important when you operate in the cloud, because you have the connections in between applications with your infrastructure. So one of the things you need to understand is, who's using the APIs? Have they been updated? Is there a formal process to evaluate APIs? And a lot of it then becomes, one of the things I find very interesting is that there's a lot of organizations that don't understand the concept of enterprise architecture. So you think of, in the physical world, when you build a structure, one of the first things you do is you engage an architect. And if you skip that step and you go and build a structure, the chances of it having the right level of integrity go way down. And think of technology infrastructure, especially as you have either hybrid environments or multi-cloud environments. One of the most important things fundamentally is to have a solid architecture and framework. And once you have that, then you can understand, so how do I protect the environment as best I can? So how do you deal with this? Well, here are 5 steps that get you mostly to nirvana. So you need to treat security as a team sport. You have to make sure that you're engaging the organization and people understand what the roles are. You need to reduce complexity and the number of vendors you use with a platform approach. As I think Chris was saying, complexity is the enemy of protecting information, right? The simpler the architecture, the better. There's a lot of legacy tools that don't allow you to protect information in cloud environments fundamentally, so you need to select the right set of tools. Automation is something that's going to allow predictability. So again, going back to manufacturing, if you look at the evolution of manufacturing, there's been much more automation that's been introduced into manufacturing processes. You think of back when Henry Ford started his company, he created the notion of assembly line, so you had a lot of reliability on humans, and you had predictability. Everyone did their job. But humans, when they get involved, there tend to be errors, right? And so there's certain tasks that automation really plays in very well. So automation is something that's going to help you have predictability and protect the environment adequately. And finally, gaining visibility into cloud. One of the things that I generally talk about is, the most important thing that you need to do is really understand what do you have, what's going on, what's unusual in the environment. Because if you don't understand that, then you won't be able to take action when something unusual is happening. So this is one of the things that becomes really important. You have to make sure that developers, architects, and technology and cybersecurity engineers understand you have to build security in from day one, but you also need to give them context, right, in terms of what does this mean to me as a technology professional. So one of the talk tracks I like to use with developers is I want to make sure I'm partnering with you and giving you the right tools so that you can produce good code, right? Code that has the right security hygiene in it. And linked with that is proper governance. So if you've worked in security for a given period of time, you know that there's typically tension in between security and the technology teams. And they may or may not perceive security as something that's important to them. And the way I like to communicate it is, I don't want you as a developer to be the cause of a security issue, right? You don't want arrows pointing at you. And my job is to work with you to give you the tools so that not only do you protect yourself, but you protect the organization. And that message typically works the vast majority of the time. But there's always a certain percentage of people that won't listen to that message. And that's where, proper governance comes in. So if the right policy decisions have been made at a senior level, you can say, look, I'm here to help you out, but if you disagree and you don't follow what I'm telling you, I need to go up through my organization, and ultimately the word is going to come down to you and say, this is what you need to do, and this is important. And I want to avoid that, right? So I want to make sure that I work with you up front. And that usually underscores the point in terms of convincing technology professionals to do their job. Going back to it's a team sport. So adopting a platform approach is one of the ideal practices. So if you think of, I think it was Gary Hayslip yesterday was saying that SoftBank has over 300 cloud applications and infrastructure platforms that they use. And relatively speaking, SoftBank is a mid-size company, right? It's not a huge enterprise. So think of large enterprises, especially the ones that have a large number of business partners. The major cloud providers have really good native tools, right? Google has them, Amazon, Microsoft, Salesforce, et cetera. But if you're dealing in an environment that has dozens, if not hundreds of applications, using the native tools becomes unattainable. And when you have a large number of tools, it's very easy for things to slip through the cracks. So in an ideal scenario, you have a small set of tools that you're using in a multi-cloud environment. And one of the things that we've seen that works very well is to have 5 or fewer vendors for a particular solution. It's very hard to get to one, but the fewer the better. And I remember, gosh, probably 20 years ago, we were using best-of-breed tools simply because there wasn't a good vendor that was bringing a whole suite of solutions to the table that we thought were solving our issues in the banking world. That environment has changed, and environments in general have become much more complex. Going back to what I was alluding to earlier, integrating security into the development process, and not just in the development process, but also in the production environment. And one of the things you have to do ultimately is take a look and understand, has what I've implemented, is it still secure? So you've got to have the right set of tools that create a healthy DevSecOps environment, as well as tools to understand what's going bump in the night. Part of it becomes the use of automation. So if you think of the things that you have to do in terms of managing a multi-cloud environment, one of the things you need to do is implement code, infrastructure as code, workloads. There's a short list of things that you have to do. And having the tools to be able to implement workloads into production, for example, if you have a good image that has the right security properties built in, every time that you implement a workload, it's going to be more secure. And when you have issues and you need to fix things, changing the image, that standard image, and then implementing it again becomes much easier than going to n number of hundreds or thousands of workloads in the cloud. And finally, having comprehensive visibility across multi-cloud environments. Again, going back to, you need to understand what you have across traditional infrastructure and in cloud environments. So what's the state of affairs with my workloads? What's the state of affairs with my data? I need to have a comprehensive picture of that. And not only do I have to have a comprehensive picture, but the ideal scenario is that I have one pane of glass, if you will, where I can see anything unusual. And when alarm bells go off, I have a good understanding of what it is and what I need to do. So going back to the Target example, Target actually had a lot of good tools in place when they had their breach, but no one was manning the intrusion detection and protection system. So think of if you have a home alarm from ADT, think of the people at their command center that aren't watching the blinking lights. And that's the type of scenario that Target had. And that's the type of scenario you want to avoid. So I'll leave you with several thoughts. The DevOps pipeline has expanded greatly, and as a consequence, so has the attack surface. There is a sense of urgency to move to the cloud. And in particular, if you look at what's been happening in the last few weeks economically, we're going back to an environment where leadership teams are beginning to question, okay, we think we're going into an economic downturn, so what do we need to do to control our costs? So I would predict that there's going to be a continued acceleration of movement to the cloud, because that's going to reduce operating costs for a typical enterprise. You have to manage the DevOps pipeline with cloud-native tools and make sure that the DevOps pipeline is protected. So there's a sense of urgency to move to the cloud, but moving to the cloud and spending a lot of money in the cloud does not necessarily equate to having a secure environment. You've got to, going back to the things that you need to do on a core level, is create a solid technology architecture, right? So what's going to allow us to function in a multi-cloud environment as a large enterprise? And bake in security standards into that process. I was actually fortunate in a couple of my roles where either I was brilliant or I didn't run to the door quickly enough. You pick your scenario of what makes sense there. But I helped create the technology architecture organizations in a couple of banks. And the benefit for me was I was able to inject security standards into the fundamental technology architecture. So for example, one of the things that we did was we said for every web application, it's going to tie into web single sign-on. We're going to use provisioning. We're going to encrypt in this particular method. And that creates consistency and the right level of protection. DevSecOps integration and security automation are core components to achieving a successful cloud adoption. Again, going back to baking in security, having a method, a repeatable method that allows you to implement and manage applications and infrastructure. And one of the other benefits to that is, there's a limited number of resources that we have. We simply can't hire enough people. And automation is something that allows you to be much more efficient, rely on a smaller number of people. And finally, consolidate the number of security vendors that you're using so that you can, in fact, have a successful implementation and management of cloud environments. Ultimately, that's the recipe. And I think the thing I would leave you with is finally, you have to put this all into business context, right? You need to know how to tell a good story. So what's the benefit of moving to the cloud? How do I do it securely? Who needs to be involved? How do I get to the end game gracefully? And really understand, what skill sets do I have? Which ones don't I have? And who can I rely on if I don't have those skill sets? If you put that all together, then you're going to have a successful cloud adoption. And ultimately, you need to communicate the message of, so what do I get out of all of this as an enterprise? It's not just implementing technology for technology's sake, right? It's allowing me to function more effectively as a business, reduce cost, and if you put in the right amount of security ingredients, when you have issues, hopefully you have a brush fire instead of a 5-alarm fire. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Happy to take some questions. Yeah, Rich.
What is the most important lesson you should walk away with?
I think the most important, the question was, what is the most important thing that you should walk away with from this presentation? I would say a couple of things. Build security into processes that you're doing as an organization, with a particular focus on application development and protecting workloads and containers. I'd say that's a short list of things. And I think there's a couple of levers that you can use to make sure that happens. One of them is going back to communication and making sure that people understand why is this important, right? It's, there's a lot of security organizations that are the business prevention units, right? They're the guys and gals that say no. And not only that, but they generally don't communicate well, and they don't communicate in terms that others understand. So if you can communicate up to the leadership team as to, here's the benefits we're getting from doing this, and you have a message to the developers, to people that are working in infrastructure, that we've made a decision that security is important to us as an organization, and here's your role in protecting information. That may be a bit of a long-winded answer, but that, in my mind, when you walk away, those are the things you should be thinking about. Well, we'll let you go again, Rich, just because you're you. So Rich's question was, I was talking about workforce development. what should a young person getting into the workforce be thinking about? There's a couple things. In security, there simply aren't enough people to go around. So I would say that entering the field of security is something that's a really good bet. Because there aren't enough people generally get paid well. Number one, it's an issue that isn't going away. And so getting into security is something that's great, and there's so many things that you can do. There's so many areas of specialization. I think of just identity and access management. There are about a dozen areas of specialization within identity. And then there's anything else from application security to database security to infrastructure security. It's a really robust field. The second thing I would say to someone that's entering the field is find a mentor, find someone that can be your Sherpa, that can guide you along the way. So dinosaurs like myself, for example, or Kate raised her hand. We have our experiences, and we can help you. If nothing else, you have the benefit from our experiences and say, these are the things that I've done well in my career, these are the things that I would avoid. And also help you understand what are your goals in your career, right? You're going to enter in this particular role if it's an entry-level position and you're coming out of school. There's a lot of different paths that you can go down as you mature in your career. So I could have a technical career, I could have a leadership career. And I think the other thing is that having a technical role is something to seriously consider over time, because not everyone has the leadership skills to lead a security organization or technology organization. It's like not every lawyer makes a good general counsel, and not every CPA makes a good CFO, and not every technologist makes a good CIO, or not every good security person makes a good CISO. So really understanding what's your target, what do you like to do, what makes sense for you as an individual, that's what I would be communicating to someone that's joining the workforce. Kate. So let me unpack everything you just said, because you mentioned a lot. So I think ultimately the question was, we're moving to the cloud, and yet we have a lot of technology debt as large enterprises. So is there a possibility that we could overcorrect and move to the cloud when ultimately there's things that either make sense to keep within traditional infrastructure, or we may have a need to move back? I think that was your question somewhere in there. Yeah. So not every organization is created equal, right? And you think of banks, for example. I'm not so sure you're going to see the average bank move their money moving systems into the cloud. There are exceptions to that, but if I think of the large banks like the Citis or B of A's or Wells Fargo's, I don't see them moving their deposit systems to the cloud. I don't see them moving their trading system to the cloud. And trading systems, not only in terms of security, but in terms of the latency that you have, because when you're doing real-time trading, milliseconds matter. A lot of it really goes back to, in my mind, what's ideal for me as an organization, right? What assets should I, in fact, move to the cloud? and how do I protect them properly? And you have to go back periodically and revisit what you have and how has technology changed. You know, organizations change. They may do acquisitions or divestitures, start a new line of business. So what I'm doing today may or may not be relevant a year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now. So you have to go back and visit, does a decision that I made today on October 1st of 2022 make sense a year from now? And if it doesn't, what's the course correction that I make? Hopefully that answered your question. Okay, great, thanks. Yes? Yeah, so the comment was that I haven't mentioned anything about compliance, and is that important? It absolutely is. Every enterprise has its regulation, well, most of them have their regulatory requirements they need to comply with. So if you think of healthcare, for example, there's the regulations such as HIPAA and high tech, et cetera, that they have to comply with. You know, pharmaceutical companies have their FDA requirements as they bring a drug to market. You know, banks have all their regulations they have to comply with. So one of the things that becomes important, so the short answer is yes, compliance is important. And one of the ways to get there is to have a comprehensive approach. So using something like ISO or NIST as a framework, right? It's a comprehensive recipe on how do you protect information in a large environment. And one of the things that you need to do is make sure that the regulators understand that what you're doing is commercially reasonable, right? Because ultimately you're going to have a problem. And you're going to face two issues. You're going to face the wrath of the regulators, and then there'll be people like Rich that will be defending someone and say, you know, we've got a problem here. How do we address it? And sooner or later, you'll probably end up in court. But if you can communicate clearly and make a good case that what you've done is commercially reasonable, then I'm going to satisfy the regulators and the lawyers and the auditors. So compliance is something I definitely need to keep into account, and mapping it back to what I'm doing, taking a comprehensive approach, ultimately helps you address compliance issues. Hopefully that answers your question. Any other questions? Comments? Insults? Well, thank you very much. I know you're going to enjoy the next presentation. Rich Marshall is a tremendous presenter. Enjoy the rest of the conference.